This week, I'm speaking with Bonnie Marcus, author of Not Done Yet: How Women Over 50 Regain Their Confidence and Claim Workplace Power. This is a replay of one of the top episodes from 2021. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 319 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. My wife and I are now in Austin, but only after a long 2-day drive across central Mexico and Texas. Therefore, I'm behind in getting episodes produced for this podcast. Therefore, I am rebroadcasting one of the top episodes from 2021, which is episode 250, where I spoke with Bonnie Marcus, author of Not Done Yet: How Women Over 50 Regain Their Confidence and Claim Workplace Power. Let me read a bit from her Amazon bio. Award-winning entrepreneur, Forbes contributing writer, executive coach Bonnie Marcus, Master of Education, assists professional women to successfully navigate the workplace and position and promote themselves to advance their careers. With 20 plus years of sales and management experience, Bonnie's extensive business background includes CEO of a ServiceMaster company and VP of Sales at Medical Staffing Network, and 2 other national companies in the healthcare and software industries. She has held executive positions in startup companies and Fortune 500 companies. Bonnie started her corporate career at an entry-level position and worked her way up to the top of a national company. Her passion is now to help other women embrace their talent and ambition and step into their full potential and workplace power. Bonnie shares her message globally through speaking engagements, live and virtual workshops, blogging, and her popular podcast, Badass Women at Any Age. I'm going to skip any sponsorship of this episode and get right to my discussion with Bonnie Marcus. Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast. I have the real joy of having Bonnie Marcus on the podcast, and she is the author of Not Done Yet: How Women Over 50 Regain Their Confidence and Claim Their Workplace Power. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mark. It's great to be here.
Why did you write this book?
Well, let's see, about 4 years ago, I was coaching a 58-year-old female attorney who was working in Silicon Valley. And she was on the legal team for a large tech startup. And she started to notice that things were happening. She wasn't invited to key meetings. Her workload was redistributed to some of her younger colleagues. And she was concerned because she knew that if she didn't have a normal portfolio, it would be easier for the company to kind of push her out. And, Mark, I said, this can't be an isolated incident. This has to be something that is much more prevalent for women of this age, over 50, not just in tech, but across all industries. So I started to do a lot of research. I started to do a lot of interviews, and I found that, not only is this very prevalent, but we don't know much about it because a lot of women are experiencing this in silence. They are afraid to speak up because they fear losing their jobs. And they are really worried about bringing more attention to their age. So I like to say, this is where women were before Me Too, when we were also suffering in silence and afraid to talk about our experiences. We didn't have a safe environment. We didn't have legal backing, because many of the women that I interviewed for the book insisted on being anonymous. So you'll see the first names, Linda or Kay or Rita, not their real names, because they were still working and they were fearful.
Yeah. Fear it's a very dangerous emotion. Yeah. And sometimes we get fearful for things that we had no business to be fearful. And the other times we should be a lot more fearful than we are.
Yeah. And so, I talk about both the internal beliefs and fears and stereotypes that we have as women as we age, as well as some of the external challenges that we face due to ageism, which are real in the workplace, especially.
Yeah. The one thing that resonated with me with the book, when you start talking about appearance, and obviously I'm 65 now, when I would go to work, I didn't spend lots of time putting makeup on. I shaved, showered.
Oh, come on.
I had progressively less and less hair to take care of. So.
Yeah, but Mark, the research shows that as men age, they actually are viewed as more valuable and more competent, and their income increases. And for women, the opposite happens.
Yep.
As we show visible signs of aging, we're viewed as irrelevant, less competent, as if our competence is tied to how many wrinkles we have. I mean, It's truly ridiculous, but that's the alarming truth.
Part one of your book is assumptions, fears, and all that crap about aging that holds you back. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, we hold our own ageist beliefs. We have our own fears. We make our own assumptions about aging and what it means to age as a woman. And so the point I really wanted to make in the book is that, there's systemic changes that need to take place, and ageism is real and all that kind of stuff. But we can't control a lot of that. What we can control are our own beliefs. And that's the first place to look. What are some of the assumptions that you're making about aging? And do those support you going forward, especially in your career, or do they potentially sabotage you? So, for instance, if you believe you're too old to ask for a raise, or you're too old to get promoted, then you are not going to do the kinds of things you need to do to get the promotion. You're going to stay in the shadows. You're not going to raise your hand. You're not going to voice your opinion. You're not going to ask for the promotion. You're going to assume, a younger colleague will get it, or, a man will get it. I mean, that may be true, but the fact is that we don't even put ourselves out there and position ourselves and do the kinds of things that we need to do to get promoted, to get the raise. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And those are the things that we really need to look at, because we can control those. And we need to take a good hard look at some of the ways we hold ourselves back because we believe some of these things. We're too old to learn new things. We're too old to do X, Y, Z. It's a lot of crap.
Yeah. In my book, I have a chapter on something called MSU disorder. And MSU stands for make stuff up.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. But I mean, we are so bombarded by ageism in our society that you can't help but internalize it. So it's not like we're doing this in a vacuum, Mark. It's like, if you go to the store and buy a birthday card for a woman over 40 or 50, it's like, oh God, she's going to need to drink a gallon of wine to face her birthday. And, and it's a joke. It's funny. And we don't realize that, you know what? That's ageist. All this stuff is ageist. So we internalize it because it's so ingrained in our society.
When you've internalized it, how do you turn that around?
Well, the first thing is to identify what some of these beliefs are, and then ask yourself, is this true? And is this, if it's not true, which it probably is not true, and it's not based on reality, then we need to reframe it. And we need to realize that it's probably holding you back. And what are the consequences of that? And that, when you realize what the consequences are, it helps you to kind of change your thinking and change your behavior.
So part 2 of your book is stop playing small and do what it takes to stay in the game. Tell us about that.
Well, this is actually a message, no matter where you are in your career, that you need to be vigilant. And especially as you approach, as a woman and you're approaching 40, 50, maybe you're showing signs of aging, you need to understand that you're vulnerable to being pushed out or sidelined at some point. But at every point in our career, we need to be proactive and strategic, and understand that we need to do some things to stay marketable and keep our jobs. Not to allow ourselves to be marginalized and pushed aside. So some of the tips that I give in this section of the book are, first of all, declare your ambition. Sit down, have a talk with your manager and say, I'm really committed, I'm invested in continuing to work for X amount of years. How do you see me continuing to add value to this company? And come up with a plan, but be forthright about it, because your manager may, especially as you approach 60, 65, they may think you want to slow down, and maybe you don't. Maybe you do, but if you don't, then you really need to own that and declare that. Another thing I talk about is keeping a growth mindset, and keeping up on your skills is very, very important. But, even beyond that, Mark, it's what are some of the trends in your industry? Do some research and be proactive and learn some of the things that are in the future, that are coming down the pike, so that you can be at the forefront and you can really mentor others in those skills. But don't let your skills subside in any way. So those are a couple of tips on how to be proactive, how to stay relevant. In that section, I also talk about creating a visibility plan for yourself. Be very strategic about it, and I offer some tips on how to do that as well, because you really need to be visible and let people know what your value is and how you contribute.
There are a couple sections in this book, in this section, that stood out.
Mm-hmm.
One was building the cross-generational network, because so many of us are, the folks who pulled us along are now retired, out of power, or possibly dead.
Yes.
Right? And I had Ashton Applewhite on the podcast, and she talked about the fact that we age segregate.
Yes.
Right? Just society does that. Yeah, sometimes we have to get out of our own going, okay, I need to network younger.
We put people in categories based on age, actually based on gender, based on ethnicity, all of that. And then we make assumptions about them. And it isn't until we actually make one-on-one connections with people that we realize maybe, those assumptions aren't necessarily true. So reaching out and getting out of your comfort zone, because our comfort zone is to stay in our own age bracket, right? It's to stay in our little bubble. So reach out and actually find some younger colleagues that you can make connections with. And I call them win-win relationships, because they can learn a lot from you and you can learn a lot from them. And then the other side benefit, Mark, is that you are then more visible also across the organization, and more people know about you and know about your value. So the networking, and especially across generations, really helps you stay relevant.
Yeah, the other one that I really liked was the section on ask for feedback.
Yeah.
Right? Because I don't know about you, but I don't like asking for help. So asking for feedback, asking for, I don't like asking for directions. I'm a guy.
Well, the thing that I actually had fun with that section, because I wanted to make sure that the reader understood there are good ways to ask for feedback, and then there are ways that are going to get you absolutely no feedback that's valuable. And so I kind of take people through a script, the reader through a script of how to do that, to make sure that you help your manager, who probably isn't very good at giving constructive feedback, how you can kind of manage your manager to help you get the feedback that's most going to help you. So yeah, we need to get out of our comfort zone there too. Understand you don't build your career in a vacuum. You need that input. You need to know how you're being perceived, because you may think you're either doing it all wrong or you're doing it all right. And the feedback is really helpful.
Yeah, the other chapter in here I liked was learn to say no.
Yeah.
One of my favorite books is Essentialism, The Disciplined Pursuit of Less by Greg McKeown.
Mm-hmm.
And I say I've used that book in the past with several clients, of teaching them how to say no without saying no, and how saying no actually gets you more respect.
And there's an art, right, to saying no without pissing the other person off, and doing it and still maintaining relationships, but also maintaining your boundaries. And that's what's important. And I think there's a gender thing here. I think it's much more difficult for women who are very eager to please to say yes to everything. And again, putting that strategic lens and saying, well, is this something that I should do? Who's the person who's requesting it? What would be some of the benefits? Do I have the time? How can I handle this? Can I just maybe put it off or say no altogether? But being very strategic about how to respond.
Yeah, there's no question that, because I've worked with a number of women who are pleasers.
Yeah.
And they don't like saying no. It's very uncomfortable.
Yeah. I mean, in my first book, The Politics of Promotion, I talk about this a lot. And I said it's a doer trap, right? Because we're very anxious. Somebody says, oh, would you clean up the kitchen in the office? Oh, yeah, fine. Oh, would you help with this luncheon that we're putting on for? Oh, yeah, I'll do that too. And then we drown in all this work, which isn't our work. At the end of the day, we're not evaluated. It's not on our performance review, like, oh, she cleaned the kitchen every week, or she did, and it's not the way we are evaluated. And so we fall into this doer trap, what I call a doer trap, because we can't say no.
I like part 3, which is be your badass self. What is your badass self?
Your badass self is when you really know who you are and you own it. You own your talent. You own your experience. You own your wisdom. And Mark, you own the power of your age. And there's no apologizing for it. And the reason I wrote those chapters in that third section is I think that especially when we hit a certain age as women and we become invisible, or we're subjected to demeaning remarks at work, we kind of lose sight of really who we are. and we begin to see ourselves the way others may see us, as like an older person. And so we need to regain the mojo, regain the confidence so that we can stay relevant and keep our jobs and stay marketable and do the things that we need to do to take care of ourselves as well. So there's some chapters in that section which talk about self-care, about being your own best friend, loving yourself, about journaling and meditating and really staying connected with, the essence, everything of who you are. There's one part in there, especially that I write about, what battles have you fought and won? Because we forget. We really forget. So what are the battles, big and small, that we have really gone through in our lives? And what does that say about us? And own all of it.
Yeah, sometimes one of the phrases I use is when you're feeling something has gone really well, is make a mental bookmark of that so that you can go back to that time.
Yeah. And
right?
feel,
and feel that. And when you've just had a bad situation, you can go back and recover those feelings. Your opening chapter in here is take back control. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is that we give up our power, we give up control. One of the ways is not being able to say no, right? But there are many ways that we don't realize that we're giving up our control and compromising who we are. And we really need to be cognizant of the way that we give up control, the way that we give up power, and make sure that we're not compromising who we are.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, particularly in our generation, but particularly with women, that very often your career just happened and you kind of followed along and didn't make conscious decisions. I did for the longest time. I went to work for IBM and just kind of went along. And at some point in time, you say, no, I have choices.
Yeah. Well, look what's happening now with the Great Resignation, right? And after the pandemic, people are saying, oh, I have choices. I want out. And so, I think there's a great awakening, to your point right now, that we felt that we didn't have the opportunity to do. But I tell you, after I wrote the book, I did a great deal of research. And, many of the women that I interviewed, that I surveyed in my research, have been unemployed. And they're unemployed for over a year, and they don't have enough money to retire, and they want and they need to work. So not everybody has the resources to be able to say, I don't like this anymore. I think I'm gonna retire prematurely, or I'm gonna quit and take some time and figure out what I want next. It's wonderful if you can do that.
One of the things I've been researching on right now is the tie to the Great Retirement, tied to the Great Resignation, and how much of that is interrelated. Because, there are all kinds of factors between the housing market exploding, and many of us, our retirement accounts have grown significantly. At what point do you say, but then again, for most of us, I don't want to retire.
Yeah. I don't either. I did an op-ed in Business Insider this past weekend and talked about how companies are saying there's such a low employment rate and they can't find people, right? And here's this whole qualified, talented pool of women over 50 who want and need to work that they're either pushing out or not even considering hiring. So if they could fix gendered ageism, they could fix their low employment rate.
Yes. Well, there's no question. I've had Chris Farrell on the podcast a couple of times, and actually a lot more times than that. But one of the things I liked in his unretirement book was that he said at some point in time, the unemployment rate would get so low they'd have to hire older people. Unfortunately, that would also mean HR practices changing. And
it goes deeper than that. I did some research, and I did an article recently for Forbes about how artificial intelligence codifies the bias. There aren't women involved in this process. And when you have artificial intelligence looking at resumes and can't figure out the nuances where women might have had to take some time off, or they have career pivots or whatever. I mean, the companies that are using just artificial intelligence are very, very biased. Yeah.
I saw this in Austin, the tech industry, where they tend to pick their best employees and model who they were looking for. Well, when all their best employees are young white males, guess who got hired?
Yeah, but how are they judging, right? Who are the high potentials? That's another thing that artificial intelligence, where they might eliminate talented women, 50 plus.
The last two chapters I want to talk about is hang with your girlfriends.
Yeah. You live longer.
Well, there's no question that who you surround yourself with, both on a personal and a professional basis, makes a big difference.
But there's research that shows you should hang with your girlfriends, more than 2 times a week even, and that it affects your longevity. And I mean, women can be very, very supportive of each other and confide in each other. And it definitely contributes to our mental health and our stability.
And the last one was own the power of your age. So what do you mean by that?
Think that we can't be apologetic. We need to look at all of the wisdom we've accumulated over the years, all of our experiences, and some of them were not great. But what lessons did we learn from those experiences? All those lessons learned. What is our true talent? And own all of it, because if we, I don't want to be 20 again. Do you? I mean, I don't want to learn all those lessons all over again. And so we need to celebrate that. And I don't think we do that enough.
So when someone finishes reading this book, what do you want them to do?
First of all, I want them to be, to really be influenced enough to take a look in the mirror, identify some of the ways they may be holding themselves back, to really be energized, to really own the power, to be their badass self, to understand that they need to be vigilant in their careers and to really step up and do the work that they need to do on themselves and their profession.
Bonnie, this has been great. If someone wanted to reach out and contact you, and of course, buy the book,
of course,
how might they do that?
Well, they can certainly reach me through my website, which is bonniemarcusleadership.com. My email is bonnie@bonniemarcusleadership.com. All the information about my podcast, Badass Women at Any Age, is on there, as well as information about the book. But the book is available on all outlets. It's also available on Audible. It's an audio book.
By the way, all of that will be in the show notes. Thank you very much for being on the Repurpose Your Career podcast.
Thanks, Mark. It's been great.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation I had with Bonnie. I found her book quite relevant and actionable, which I think is important. If you have been listening to me for any length of time, being relevant is the key in this fast-paced world we live in. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You'll get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. When you subscribe, you'll receive my latest white paper, Ageism, the Last Acceptable Bias. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on LinkedIn. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-319. You can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbean, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.